So we've now looked at the original position in a bit more detail by examining the veil of ignorance. And what we're going to turn our attention to now is these two principles of justice. We're going to turn our attention to what exactly they are, to describing them in more detail. And then, so we're going to have a video on the first principle, and then two videos on the second principle, one each on each of the subparts of the second principle. And then once we have this detailed understanding of the original position and the two principles of justice, we're going to talk about, and this is really what we're building to, we're going to talk about why people in the original position would adopt or agree upon these two principles of justice, why they would structure society according to these two principles and not any others. That'll be the last video from this week. So first thing, let's talk about the principle of equal liberty. Let's talk about it in more detail. So it's probably the most straightforward of the three different principles that we're going to look at, right? There are two principles, but then two principles of justice, but there are kind of two sub-principles in the second part for a total of three principles. The principle of equal liberty is in certain ways the most straightforward, right? Everyone has an equal right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with the same liberties for all. A couple things to talk about to get a little bit clearer on. What exactly does he mean by basic liberty? That's one. What exactly are the basic liberties? That's two. And then lastly, what does it mean compatible with the same liberties for all? Most extensive, compatible with the same liberties for all. And that'll be the third thing we look at. So first, what exactly is a basic liberty? Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, never actually says, and this was a point that readers of Rawls, after A Theory of Justice was published, kind of pressed him on. And so later on, he ended up giving this kind of very technical notion of what a basic liberty is. According to Rawls, his own account of what a basic liberty is, it's a liberty that's necessary for creating a society in which people can develop what Rawls calls their two moral powers. And the two moral powers are a sense of justice and a conception of the good. And so a basic liberty is a liberty that's necessary for creating a society in which people can develop themselves so that they can develop a sense of justice, and so they can develop a sense of or a conception of what a good life entails, right? So they can have a comprehensive view of things, of what's valuable and worthwhile in life, and of what's right and just. So certain liberties are going to be necessary in order for rational agents, persons, to develop themselves as rational agents or persons. That's kind of the idea, right? There are going to be liberties that are necessary not just for bodily survival, but for developing our rational reasoning capacities, our moral capacities in particular, something like that. That's Rawls's technical notion. I think the more intuitive or commonsensical notion is also likely intended, right? A basic liberty, it's like a fundamental liberty. One way people have tried to describe it, it's a liberty that is kind of, there's no bargaining over. There's no non-negotiable. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. They're non-negotiable liberties. These are liberties that no one would agree freely and rationally to be without, right? So they're these absolutely fundamental liberties. And so the principle of equal liberty requires that everyone be given the most extensive basic liberties compatible with the same liberties for all. You can contrast basic liberty with kind of non-basic liberty, or non-basic right, right? Liberties and rights have a very close relationship. So, for example, Because I'm a faculty member of the philosophy department at Loyola, my Loyola ID can open the Crown Center when it's locked because I got an office there, right? And so that liberty has been granted to me. I have the liberty to go into the Crown Center at any time I choose, right? I use my card, I swipe it on the door, and I can get in. That's a liberty that Loyola gives to me in virtue of my position in the institution. That's not a basic liberty, though, right? That's not a fundamental, non-negotiable liberty. It's a highly negotiable liberty, right? In fact, during the COVID shutdown, they took it away. They wouldn't let me into the Crown Center. And that's fine, right? I don't know. I don't really care. It's negotiable, sure. Right. So basic liberties would contrast with these, I don't know what you call them, non-basic liberties, non-fundamental liberties. And so basic liberties are these really important fundamental ones to people. What exactly are they, though? Rawls gives lists. He gives a list of them. And it's kind of what you would expect. So he talks about freedom of thought and liberty of conscience, freedom of speech. The political liberties are very important. A right to vote, a right to be eligible to hold office. It's not a right to hold office. Nobody has that right, but the right to be eligible to hold it, right? Because maybe it'd be a very bad idea for you to be a politician because you are, for whatever reason, right? Nonetheless, you should be given the freedom to run for office. You should have the right to be eligible to hold office. He talks about a freedom to own personal property. And it's just like your kind of personal effects, clothing, and so on. Even people who call for the abolition of kind of very famously call for the abolition of private property. People like Marx, they wouldn't disagree with this. We'll get to it when we get to Marx. But when Marx calls for the abolition of property, he's not calling. He makes he's explicit about this. Makes an exception for what he calls personal property. Should be things like clothing and so on, but whatever, we'll get to it later. So that's not a particularly controversial point. I guess that's what I'm saying. And then freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure, right? So it's kind of these basic fundamental rights. Everyone is going to have an equal right to these basic liberties, is what the first principle of justice says. Right? These kind of political liberties, these political rights. And Rawls's view is that it's primarily the job of the political constitution, of that part of the basic structure of society, of that major social institution, to ensure that the principle of equal liberty is complied with, right? The political constitution ought to comply with this principle of equal liberty. Last thing that I want to mention is this bit about compatible with the same liberties for all, right? The most extensive basic liberties compatible with the same liberties for all. Essentially what he's getting at here, and what the idea seems to be, is that our liberties and our rights, we should be granted as large a sphere of liberty as possible. And the limits to that sphere are going to be determined simply by other people's freedoms and liberties, right? That my liberties or rights end where yours begin. Right? That's I don't know, a kind of cliche phrase that you hear. That's essentially what Rawls is giving voice to here. I don't have what Hobbes called the right of nature, this liberty to everything. No, my liberty, my rights end at a certain point. There's a limitation, right? That's what Rawls is getting at. And so we have these liberties, but they only stretch, they only extend so far as everyone can equally have them. That's the idea. That's what Rawls is getting at. My rights, my liberties end where yours begin. So I don't have a right, for example, to your property, whereas Hobbes would say that, right? According to Hobbes, I do have a right to your possessions. Rawls would say I don't. I have a right to my own property. You have a right to your own property, right? And that's the limits of our rights to these possessions. something like that, right? I don't have a right to your stuff. That's the idea of principle of equal liberty. It is, I think, pretty clearly the most straightforward, the most intuitive of the principles that Rawls gives.